Yay, lay, 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 lay. Yay, lay, 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 lay. Yay, lay, 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 lay. Yay, lay, 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 lay. Duror Yikra. Let us proclaim freedom, or let liberty ring throughout all the lands. Welcome everyone, and welcome especially our special guest, Christine.
Thank you.
This is part of an ongoing series that we've done for almost a year and a half, or a little more, almost 2 years now. Taboo topics of challenging conversations and taking on potentially controversial topics and learning how to have the conversation and having the courage to bring them to awaken our minds, open our hearts, and expand our society. So I'm going to have Ginny, who's our adult education chair, introduce our special guest, and then we'll turn it right over to Christine.
Well, I'm really excited and happy to welcome Christine here this evening with us. Christine, I've known her from Mile High actually for quite some time, and she was in the practitioner class, I think right behind me and Janice and Wesleyan. So we have Wesleyan, Janice, and Ginny who we were the frog class together, and then Christine was in the class right after us, I think. Is that right? And most recently, Christine has got her master's from the Holmes Institute in religious, tell me the...
Consciousness studies. It's
consciousness.
Master of Arts in
I
Consciousness
knew better. There's no no religious stuff.
No religious. No, we're just consciousness.
It's just consciousness. And I think a lot of us actually who are here know Christine. So I'm very, very excited I've heard, she's a wonderful speaker, and I think we're really lucky to have Christine here with us tonight. So thank you for coming. Is there something I missed that I should say?
No, it's all good.
All right.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. I put together a little slideshow just because I thought it might help us with the conversation, and we can stay with it or not stay with it as the case may be. So let's see how sharing works. Look at that.
That's beautiful.
How pretty is that, huh?
Wow.
Is that right?
That's very nice.
I always overthink everything, okay, so I'll just own that. I want to get rid of my closed caption, so just give me a second to do that. I don't know how I'm going to get rid of it. Okay, we'll just not worry about it. So we're going to talk tonight about transgender stuff, I guess is what it is. So I just kind of thought I would start and introduce myself, so I didn't assume everybody knew who I was or what my story was. I thought we'd talk a little bit about the current state of transgender issues in this country and around the world, because it seems like you can't do anything without reading something about somebody enacting a law against transgender care or affirmation or things like that. And then if we're feeling really like we want to go into the taboo topic, we can talk about transgender women and girls being allowed to compete in sports as women and girls, because that certainly seems to have everyone quite excited about that. And you can always tell where somebody comes on that issue as to whether they pose the question of, like, do you agree with biological males being allowed to compete against females? And it's like hardly anybody would say, oh yeah, it sounds like a great idea to me. But that's part of the whole thing, is what terminology you use and things. So let me see what I put in my slides, and we'll see whether any of this stuff makes sense. And hopefully it will. I had this quote came up a while back on Insight Timer, and I always think that it's great when you have a quote that makes sense with what you're doing, and it seemed like it applied to me. So when we can no longer change a situation, we're challenged to change ourselves, and I'm always a big Viktor Frankl fan. So I think a lot of that speaks to my journey, is when I could no longer change the situation, I decided to change myself to match who I always knew myself to be. So who am I? It was interesting when I was thinking about what attributes of the roles I play that I want to highlight. So I am a transgender woman. I'm a transgender activist and advocate. Don't go around trying to pick fights with people, but mostly try to educate people and help create more compassion between the cisgender and the transgender community. I'm an almost minister, soon to be reverend, with the Centers for Spiritual Living. I'm an ex-husband, I'm an ex-wife, I'm a father, and I'm a nana, which is kind of interesting to have all these different roles that I get to embrace in my life. Whether any of those are who I truly am, they're all labels that people use to describe me at various points in my life. I transitioned from male to female in 2017, which was rather late in my life, so that I could follow my heart and live my truth. Shortly after my 60th birthday, I was trying to figure out what my life purpose was, and so I prayed a lot about it, and I meditated a lot about it, and the answer came to me: just be yourself. And at the time I thought that was like, really, God, this is like the best you've got for me? I'm talking to unlimited intelligence and just telling me to be myself. But then I realized I'd never had the courage to be myself. Because when I was 3, I told my mom that God made a mistake and I was supposed to be a girl. And she didn't really see it that way, and no one in my life really saw it that way. So I kind of learned to hide that and wrap it in shame and keep it to myself as my secret. But at some point when that message came through, I got to where I thought, I don't want to live my whole life with no one ever knowing who I really am. And so at 61, I got the courage to transition and decided that I would live the rest of my life as a woman and as Christine Renee Monks. So that's the Cliff Notes story of how this all came about. And I don't really want to make this all about me, but if you're curious about any of it, because it was one of the more courageous things I've ever done in my life, okay? Because I really didn't know how it was going to work out. And I wasn't sure I wanted to blow my entire life up. To that point, most people thought of me as a heterosexual male, and I had a lot of splaining to do to people that maybe I had not been totally transparent about that. So that was 7 years ago. That happened in June of 2017. So June is a big month for me. You know, I graduated from ministerial school and my master's on June 2nd. I legally became Christine Renee Monks female on June 9th of 2017. And I had my gender-affirming surgery on June 5th of 2019. So for me, just like in the musical Carousel, June is busting out all over. And it's Pride Month too. Yeah. So it just, you know, God works in strange and mysterious ways, and I just have to trust that it's all unfolding for the highest and best, which I do believe. So that's all I really wanted to start off with, talking about me. We can talk later if anybody has questions, or if anybody does have questions, I'm happy to answer those. But what I wanted to talk about, I wanted to spend a couple minutes going over some terms, because it's always tough if you assume everybody knows all the vernacular of this whole group of things we know as gender identity and gender expression. So I'm not going to turn it into my Trans 101 talk, because that's not really what we want to talk about. But it's better to not have somebody say, what exactly do you mean when you say gender expression or gender identity or things like that? So I pulled a couple of terms that I thought we at least all ought to agree about, or at least I'll tell you what they mean and you can understand what it, how I use that because some of this will come up when we start talking about the laws that are being passed around the country and around the world. So gender identity is a term that refers to how a person feels about themselves or how they identify as being a man or a woman or masculine or feminine or things along those lines. And sometimes, we talk about it, it's what's between your ears, not what's between your legs. So for most of us, our sex and our gender are in alignment, but for a number of us, it isn't that way. So this has to do with how we self-identify internally. Gender expression takes it a little further outside, and it says, how do I show up in the world? Okay, when you look at me, do you see a woman, or do you see a man, or do you see somebody that you're not really sure what you see? And so gender expression talks mostly about masculinity or femininity or things like that. So when you look at someone, you presumably make a judgment on that. And I just finished a class in cross-cultural psychology, and they were talking about the representativeness heuristic, which is how you decide whether something is representative enough of what your ideal of it is, that you say, oh yeah, that's a dog, or that's a cat, or that's a woman, or that's a man. Because you have an idea in your brain and you don't want to go through and do all the research to figure it out. You just decide that, oh, yeah, I think I know what that is or who that is. So gender expression deals with that. If we get into it a bit with some of the younger people, there's a lot more gender neutrality or gender fluidity that we're seeing. I'm not really very gender fluid. I'm a woman 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that's who I want to be. But there are a lot of times people come and feel, more masculine or more feminine and choose to express themselves fluidly. And sometimes I think that has to do with how rigidly we define gender roles. We start socializing people from gender from the minute they are born. We have to put them in pink or blue so we know how to treat them. I mean, who cares if you treat a one-day-old baby? You could just love that expression of God and not worry about whether it's a boy or a girl. But people seem like they really do want to know those things. So that's gender expression. So transgender. So I described myself as a transgender woman earlier. Trans is a Latin word that means across from or on the other side of. So when we talk about a transgender person, their gender, what's between their ears, is on the other side of the gender they were assigned at birth or of their sex. So that's how the term comes into it. So if you think of, transatlantic, it's on the other side of the Atlantic. Transgender is on the other side of gender. So we talk about that as someone's sex assigned at birth is different than how they identify as a gender. It's also kind of an umbrella term used to describe anybody who doesn't follow societal norms for gender expression or gender roles. So it's almost become so umbrella that I'm not sure I even know what it means anymore in some ways. I've seen definitions that say drag performers are transgender and all these things, and I think, well, just because you dress up and perform as somebody that you're not, I don't know that that has anything to do with how your internal identity is. So for a lot of my academic papers and scholarly papers I wrote, because I wrote a whole bunch of them on this topic because it interests me and it was useful stuff for me. I don't know that I think somebody who puts a dress on and goes up and performs on stage is transgender, although you will find definitions that put that all under the arc. Cisgender is a word, and it's cis, not like S-I-S, not like sissy, it's cis, but it means on the same side as. It's another Latin word. So people who are cisgender, their gender identity and their sex assigned at birth align with each other. And most of the people in the world are cisgender. They don't question when they're told they're a boy, or they don't question when they're told they're a girl, and they're socialized and raised with those values and things, and that seems appropriate. And so that's how that goes. Any questions on those things so far? You're probably all really expert at it, right? Rabbi,
Just
you
a
have
point,
something?
the Hebrew translation for trans is Hebrew.
Really?
A Hebrew is one who crosses to the other side.
To the
Yeah.
other side. And what did they cross to the other side of?
The Sea of Reeds, the Red Sea,
Okay.
the wilderness to get to the land of Israel, from dictatorship to
Yeah.
freedom and democracy,
I
etc.
love that. Some of my scholarly papers where I've written about the Hebrew Bible and looked at it from a transgender hermeneutic, which is a lens of interpretation typically for, sacred texts. I've pointed out that Adam wasn't the name of the first person around. Adam means humankind, right?
Right.
And it's really not capitalized in the Hebrew Bible, so it's like, I think it's probably far more likely that the first member of humankind was a female rather than a male, because that makes far more sense. But we don't really have a lot of the sacred feminine in either the Christian text or the Hebrew text, so it's kind of interesting stuff. But I did not know that that's what Hebrew meant, so thank you.
Well, and the Hebrew text in chapter 1 says that God made Adam, the human being, earthling, male and female.
Right.
Right?
In one.
Or masculine and feminine is probably more accurate.
Yeah.
Male and female.
I've got the Tanakh, and so I go back and I research it. I've got the Oxford edition of it, I think, or the Blue Book is the one I've got, which is hopefully more scholarly. But it's got lots of footnotes. It's very fascinating to read all that. So anyway, thank you for sharing that.
I love that, though. The male and female in one. I think that's beautiful.
Yeah. Well, just because it says we made them both doesn't mean that they, I think people really get it's very interesting how people choose what they want to interpret very literally out of the text, isn't it? So anyway, so just to be clear, a transgender woman was assigned male at birth. I may have got my slides out of the, but anyway, AMAB is short for assigned male at birth, and identifies as and presents as a woman, whereas a transgender man was assigned female at birth and identifies and presents as a man. Sometimes you'll see MTF or M2F. Those are not really preferred terms anymore, but it's male to female transgender or transsexual person. So transsexual, since I have it in my definition, it generally tends to be more of a medical term rather than an umbrella term, but it means someone who has either surgically altered their body or hormonally altered their body. It's not just, it's more of a, it's typically used if you're trying to be more specific, but normally you wouldn't call somebody transsexual unless they self-identified that way. And then the same thing with the FTM and the F2M. They're both outdated terms. I think this is the last key term I have here. It's queer is just an umbrella term to identify people who don't identify as straight and or cisgender. It's kind of a short for LGBTQ or LGBTQIAS, and all that kind of stuff, which gets longer and longer. It was always kind of a pejorative term and a slur, but it's not, people have kind of reclaimed it and said with pride now. So I think, so a lot of times people will talk about being part of a queer community and queer versus straight. So anyway, I think those are the terms I left in from this. Does anybody online have any questions or anything they want to say?
Do we know what the word queer actually means?
I didn't look it up. Other than
I wonder
I
what the
found.
derivation is of that.
Well, Robert Frost would have said, "My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near," but I think he was using it in a different It's amazing to look at how words change over time, isn't it? I mean, even the term gay didn't really mean how we use it now. It just, people were gay and happy and things like that. So, See, this one should have been, this slide should have come before. So sex assigned at birth is a term you sometimes encounter, and it seems pretty self-explanatory, but it's when you were born and the doctor looks between your legs and says it's a boy or it's a girl. Sometimes people present with ambiguous genitalia, but ambiguity is really not embraced in the West for sure. So most of the time somebody makes a decision is like, no, this is who you are and what you're going to be. So one of the things that I thought we could talk about a little bit was why it seems like this whole trans is such a big deal these days, okay? For years and years, hardly anybody ever talked about transgender issues, and you'd think that nobody was trans until 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and that's clearly not the case. But it's interesting that this slide has a study that was done by the Pew Research about the percent of adults who say their gender is different from that assigned at birth. And out of all the adults, there's 1.6% who either identify as transgender or non-binary. So non-binary would mean you don't see gender as binary. Either you're male or you're female, A or B, one or the other. That would be binary gender. Non-binary says, well, it might be some shade of gray in between those two things. I'm either both or I'm neither, or I feel like I can move fluidly between them. Typically, I found research that says 1 in 10,000 people was typically thought to identify as transgender. And it was mostly people who were assigned male at birth who felt like they were really girls or women, depending on at what point they expressed that. Whereas now it's gotten a lot higher with people. If you notice in this ages 18 to 29, 2% of the people identify as transgender, male or female, and 3% as non-binary. So that's 5.1%. So when you think about that compared to 1 in 10,000, it's a huge, huge increase of younger people who are saying that. And you'll notice on those other two areas, 30 to 49, we've got 0.3 to 1.3, and then you get into my age bracket of the 50 plus, and now we're down to 0.2% or 0.1%, right? So you can tell that there's this real interest in this from younger people. And I do think that explains some of the pushback that we're seeing from people because they don't understand this, and things that you don't understand can be scary.
That's about the world Jewish population, by the way, 1.6%.
Wow.
There's
Lot
a
of
trans person for
similarities.
every Jew on the planet.
I would,
That's amazing.
Mate.
I've done a number of talks on othering, you know, the assigning undesirable qualities to people unlike yourself, and it's very common within the trans community. But I was thinking as I was coming up here, I think Jews know a lot about being othered by other people, right? And it's like, well, they're not like us, and these are what they're like, and none of it's very attractive, right? Or none of it's very complimentary. But yeah, I didn't know that was about the same. I was surprised at how few, you know, how small Jewish population of the world is. You know, in some of my world religions classes, we look and see all the breakdown, and it seems a lot smaller than I thought it would be. So interesting stuff. So for a long time, nobody even knew a trans person. That's kind of an interesting thing. You look back on some of the previous studies, and people would say 80% of the people didn't know a trans person, and they don't believe they'd ever met a trans person. Now, whether they had or not, that may be a different thing, right? A lot of times people just blend, they go stealth, they don't want to say anything about where they've been, which I understand because it's a lot easier and it's a lot safer in some ways to do that. But if none of us ever speak our truth, then we go from living one lie to another lie, right? I live a lie presenting as a man when I don't feel like a man, and now I present as a woman but don't tell anybody that there was ever anything before that. So we just go from one untruth to another untruth. But anyway, it's becoming a lot more so, whereas now 44% of all adults say they know somebody who's transgender. 65 plus people, only 33% of the population knows someone who's transgender. But 18 to 29, 52% do. So that makes a lot more sense, right? Is that the younger people are, gender expression, gender fluidity is a lot more open and less controversial, it seems like, with younger kids. Not a huge difference between whether you are a Republican or lean Republican or a Democrat or lean Democrat, okay? Those are fairly close statistically, so which is kind of interesting.
You mean in the number of people who know
Who
transgender
know
person?
somebody, yes.
Oh, wow.
42% of the people who identify as Republicans or lean Republican say they know somebody who's transgender, and 48% of the Democrats or people who lean Democrat do.
Interesting.
So not diametrically opposed at the opposite ends of that whole spectrum, right? So I don't have any statistics yet for 2024, but 2023 was the most anti-transgender legislation year in the United States. These statistics, I went back and looked today, and they haven't been updated since I did this earlier. There were over 540 anti-LGBTQ bills that were introduced in legislatures around the United States, and this is just a US thing, and that's a record, not just a really great record. Over 220 bills specifically target transgender and non-binary people, so that's also a record.
Those are counted within the 540?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the anti-LGBTQ
Just
things
also-
might be like things against drag performances or things like that.
Story time.
Yeah, exactly. Storytime. Last year they outlawed any drag performances on military bases, things like that. That don't, again, sometimes drag is collapsed with transgender, which doesn't necessarily happen that way. A lot of times people who do drag are just gay men who like to dress up and perform. So, which is fine.
Sure.
But that's the distinction between the 540 and the two.
Do we all know drag story time at libraries? We are all familiar with that. Yeah.
Yeah, for a lot of times they would have people dress up as drag queens and read stories to small kids, and in their persona,
Right.
and then some people found that was like grooming children and doing all these completely wrong kind of accusations, but
They
making
accepted
people
it
afraid.
with Shakespeare.
Yeah.
I know, exactly.
Time will change.
So as of May 23rd, 45 anti-LGBTQ laws had been enacted so far last year. And I went back to the site today, and they had not updated these statistics. But, and these are things that are, bills that either have to do with restroom usage potentially. It has to do with whether you're allowed to ask a child's pronouns or allow them to use a restroom based on their gender identity rather than their sex assigned at birth. I gave a talk for one of my ministerial speaking classes a couple weeks ago, and so I did it on the topic of othering, and I looked up the bathroom laws that were currently in effect, and it's interesting because the two worst states for bathroom laws, at least from my perspective, are Utah and Florida. And Florida is by far worse than Utah because Florida defines men and women based on chromosomes. So it is illegal for me to use the women's restroom in Florida. And it will always be illegal because presumably my chromosomes have not changed. Utah, at least in their being more reasonable, says, well, if you've had gender affirming surgery or you have documentation like a birth certificate or something that shows that's your identity, then you're not breaking the law. But it's interesting because we have never used chromosomes to identify whether people were male or female, right? I mean, I can just see the picture of going into Florida and having to do a little cheek swab before you're allowed to go use the
Exactly.
ladies' restroom, right? Or something. And I mean, and it's ludicrous, and yet somebody felt better, like we were protecting people or making a statement about our values by doing that. But it just, it keeps people like me feeling like on edge when I go into states like this. I mean, I'm not going to use the men's restroom, and I don't think anybody's going to question whether I go into the women's restroom. And it would be really unsafe for me to go into a men's restroom. Mm-hmm. Either they think I was lost, which is likely what they would do. It's like, excuse me, the ladies' room is down the hall. Or they'd know the reason I was using the ladies' or the men's restroom was because I was trans, which would probably put me in potentially a risky situation. So these kinds of things, I don't really understand why people think they're helpful, but I'm doing my best not to push against them because, the more things you push against, the more they show up in your experience. So law of attraction is really good at that. But anyway, that's kind of an interesting aspect of these statistics. So what else do I have? Do I have another slide? Yeah, so a further breakdown of those that had passed, 13 laws banning transgender or gender-affirming care for transgender youth. And that's kind of and we could talk about that topic tonight too, because that certainly is something where reasonable people could disagree about whether people under 18 should be able to access gender-affirming care and what gender-affirming care means. Does that mean delaying puberty using puberty blockers? Does that mean using cross-gender hormones? And if so, at what age? And who should be involved? And how should those decisions be made?
Are these 13 laws, are they in 13 different states?
Yeah.
Okay,
They would be.
that's what I
Yeah.
assumed.
So like Texas banning gender-affirming care for transgender kids. And
Texas, really?
no, yeah, who knew, right?
Really?
But yeah, and then potentially being prosecuted for child abuse if you're a parent trying to get your child gender-affirming care. I mean, so that just really ups the ante too, right? Or doctors who provide gender-affirming care to minors can be sued by people. Not just the parents or somebody who might have a state, but anybody in the state of Texas can challenge them. So it gets kind of insidious the way these things happen. But anyway, so that's some of these laws that have been passed. 3 laws that either allow or require misgendering of transgender students. So that would mean if I had a child who was transgender and I enrolled them in kindergarten and said, my daughter identifies as female, maybe she was assigned male at birth, but she identifies as female, those states would require the teacher to call my daughter a boy and address her as him, which is very, very difficult for a little kid to have their teacher not be respectful of them. So these are the kinds of things that, the transgender attempted suicide rate is like 25 times the regular population. It's just crazy how high it is. And things like this just seem to make it worse. I'd admire any child who has the courage to come out and say who they really are. I did not have the courage as a child, and maybe it was sufficiently different back when I was a kid that it would have just never worked. But it takes a lot of courage to do that. And a lot of times kids will change schools so that they don't have to deal with all the harassment, but then to go into a situation where your teacher is required to do that, or you're not allowed to use the restroom of your choice, is just it's just mean, I think. It's kind of bullying. I mean, that's the hard part of it. I'm an adult, I can take care of myself, but, little kids, I mean, you just don't really think of the system as being very affirming to bully them that way. And then back to some of the things we talked about, 2 laws specifically targeting drag performances. Again, maybe outlawing, drag queen story time or things like that. And I think that's about all. Oh, I have 2 more. 2 laws censoring school curriculum, including books. So, and some of that ties back to things like in Florida, the don't say gay laws, or you can't talk about the fact that anybody might be trans, or you can't talk about that, which all that does, in my experience, is make little kids feel like they're the only one in the world who feel this way, which clearly is not true, but if you don't have anybody you ever see that could be a potential ally or a role model for you, I think it makes it a lot harder. So those are the things with that. I think I'm going to stop sharing because I had a couple other slides, but I don't know that we really need to talk about that. I want to kind of open it up to things what people would like to talk about. I mean, if this is a taboo topic, we need to start saying some taboo things. Asking some taboo questions, right? I mean, this has been pretty calm so far. Yeah, I did have the genderbread person, but I don't think we need to go into the genderbread person tonight.
Yeah.
So let me stop sharing. And then we can come back to this if there's anything useful afterwards. So
I have something. Can you speak to me, there's like this elephant in the room, this really taboo elephant around the fear that has been created in our culture around people's gender identity and expression having to do with their sexuality. And so there's this fear created around the story that people are telling around transgender or people in the LGBTQ plus community as it pertains to their sexual preferences or behaviors, or that they might be extreme or different than somebody that identifies as a cisgender, which to me is completely untrue, but it's a way that we have found to separate people so that there's this fear created around what bathroom and who's doing what and what are you doing with my kids, and that there's kind of this link that's been made. And so and I think that's a confusing piece for people, that somehow we have to figure out someone's sexuality to feel safe around them. Or and Christine and I have been friends for a while, and we've given each other permission to ask each other questions around our sexuality and how we identify. And so I just appreciate you being here. And just if you could speak to that a little bit around your opinion on sexuality.
well, I think people tend to conflate all of these concepts, right? I remember when I first came out and said something to one of my friends, and it's like, oh, so you're gay. And it's like, well, I don't even know what gay means in this context. Do you think I'm gay if I like women, or do you think I'm gay if I like men? Right? I mean, seriously, because it gets very confusing, but it's like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Right? So sexual orientation or preferences, who we're attracted to, not how we identify. So it's always been interesting that transgender folks get kind of lumped in with gay, lesbian, bi kind of folks, because those are all about who we find attractive, whereas transgender is who I think I am.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, but I think it ties back to that same thing about othering that I'm saying. Is like, if I can make you othered, if I can assign less than human qualities to you, or I can tell a story about you that you're trying to groom our children to make them like yourself or whatever, and then I can make you wrong, or then I can do something with some sanctimonious belief that I'm helping the world, right? I'm making the world safe. And it's interesting because if we really think about it, cisgender white men have probably done more grooming and harm to the world throughout the time frame than anybody else has, right? I mean, we did such horrible things to the indigenous people of this country and robbed them of identity and all these things. So the idea that somehow me being myself and being my authentic self is a threat to little kids or anything. I mean, I wouldn't wish being transgender on anybody. It's a really hard way to live, okay? And what we need is compassion for people and try to understand and see how our humanity is all tied up together. I mean, I'm different than you, than everybody in this room, but that's just a celebration of God's diversity, right? If you believe anything about some higher power, you have to believe that higher power loves diversity, because you can't look around the world and not see a lot of diversity in plants and animals and human beings and everything. So I don't know whether that addresses
Yeah,
what you're
thank you.
asking, Weston. I just
yeah.
think it's I think it's just a straw man argument, though.
Yeah.
I think, again, transgender people using restrooms don't want to do anything but, go to the bathroom and get out of there and be left alone.
Like the rest of it.
Oh, it really is. It's just the idea of that. And to instill fear in people, or do it in a case where you have power over them, right? Where you're a teacher and you can call a kid out and make them go into another room or something like that. That's hard. And that's part of the whole thing. I have a lot of ambivalence about this whole thing with transgender women competing with women in sports.
Say something more about that.
There is no doubt that I have some advantage from having grown up under the influence of testosterone. I'm taller than most women. I'm not taller than all women, but I'm taller than the average woman. But to fail to recognize me as a woman or force me to compete against men would just ensure I would never win anything. So I mean, I've lost so much strength and muscle mass since going on estrogen and losing all my testosterone. It's just not even questionable. It's so apparent to me. And the challenge is that for so long transgender women were prevented completely. And then it was like, well, if you have surgery, so if we sterilize you or you sterilize yourself, then you can compete. And then at some point, the Olympics and some of these people said, well, that's really dumb. Why does it matter? I mean, a person shouldn't have to do that. If we think testosterone gives you strength, if you get your estrogen up or your testosterone down to normal female levels, then you can compete. But then there's been all this pushback. And then especially against kids. I did one of my scholarly papers on just the idea of adolescents competing. And with the laws right now, if a child has never gone through puberty, there's no advantage to them if they compete, right? If I'm a transgender girl who took puberty blockers and never went through a male puberty, then I have no advantage over a female. So why would you single me out and ridicule me and make me go to the boys' locker room? And why would you make me compete against boys? That just is humiliating to me. When I was a child, my gym teacher wanted to make sure he humiliated me, so he made me run against the girls because I wasn't very good. And that was his way of putting me down. But, this idea of being a bully to kids just doesn't make any sense to me. And so I think that whole thing, and then also in some of these states where they have that, then they've outlawed any gender affirming anything. So it's like you force a kid to go through puberty, which means now you can't ever compete against in the class of the person you want to be. So I think we ought to be really thoughtful about it, and I think we ought to err on the side of trying to be inclusive. I'm not saying there aren't any transgender athletes that haven't shown they have some advantages. But but they've also used it against, African runners and African women who have different testosterone profiles than Western white women do. So there's almost this whole little form of, racism going on with this. So it's a really slippery slope to go down with these things, to force people to either have surgery or make it illegal for them to have surgery. But I think it comes into bear a lot, since if we don't have state laws or national protections that have to do with this, then what happens if I'm competing in Jefferson County, where I'm allowed to compete as a transgender girl, and I go play Douglas County, but they won't let me compete. So now I can't play with my team, or I can't compete with my fellow athletes. So I think it's a tricky thing. Two of the papers I printed out, one was something from a transgender 17-year-old who had an editorial in the Denver Post that was talking about how meaningful it was to her to be able to actually transition and have gender affirming puberty blocking and hormone treatment. And then the other one was just on the fact that Title IX got dealt. There's a question with Title IX and the Biden administration on allowing transgender people to have protections under Title IX. And the court ruled that it wasn't covering transgender people, although it does sound like they thought it covered transsexual people. So if you've had surgery, so I mean, again, it gets really confusing about all that. So does that help a lot, or did I confuse it more?
I was just curious what your thoughts
Yeah,
were.
you would,
At the risk of being cliche, I have a theological question.
okay.
I think my assessment of part of what is so challenging to those who react with fear to transgender, transsexual realities is the theological statement you made when you were 3, that God must have made a mistake. And if they believe that God doesn't make mistakes, how could they make sense of? So maybe if you could talk about the evolution of your theology
Yeah,
from when you were 3 to now, in understanding the reality that you've experienced.
what a good question, Rabbi. Thank you.
Not too cliche.
No, it's interesting how long I held on to that story, and that I was a mistake and that God had made a mistake. Long after I transitioned, that was still my story, and I had it for so long. And at some point, my coach said to me, "Is that really true? Is that really true that you should have been born a girl?" And as I thought about it, I thought, no, there are lots of people born with vaginas. I had to do a lot more work to get mine. This is a whole different arc of the story. Seriously, my whole life experience and everything I've gone through as a demonstration of my commitment to live who I authentically think myself to be. This is a different journey than someone who's cisgender. So no, I don't think God does make mistakes, and I don't think I am a mistake, and I don't think I was. And I think this is exactly how I was supposed to turn out and what I was supposed to do. Then I get dry in my throat, and I don't make it sound like I'm nervous about it. So yeah, so I don't know. I have embraced this journey. Every day when I meditate and pray, I give thanks for this journey. It's not an easy journey. Standing authentically and vulnerably with people and owning my story and owning my journey is not always who I want to be. I don't feel like I always have to do that. I don't feel like I always need the adjective transgender in front of woman. I am a woman. My experience as a woman is not like someone who was assigned female at birth, but it's no less valid an experience. Virtually every one of us had a different experience of some kind, and we don't all have to have the identical experiences to find the commonality in this. So how's that?
Yeah, I mean, it's beautiful and inspiring. But this congregation last year spent a year studying a book about the metaphors we choose for God. And trying to expand that repertoire. I'm wondering if you have some language or technique around helping to speak about God in a way that might make it easier for someone who would think in binary terms, that right, that God doesn't make mistakes, and why would God assign at birth a different sex than the gender identity that is placed in their heart and their mind and their consciousness?
Well, that may be a question I don't have an answer to.
Okay.
But I have adopted the pronoun it to refer to God, because I don't think God is male. If I'm trying to be provocative, I might say she and refer to God, but it's only to be provocative. But clearly, a God of everything, and that's my understanding of God, both as immanent and transcendent. So expressing itself throughout all its creation, but each of us is not outside of God. God can't be all that is. So it seems like a better pronoun than they, because they implies binary and more than one. And I think God is unary. I think there's only one God. And I think it expresses itself in all sorts of ways. And I think God is for everything, even things that seem horrible to us. Because if everything is God, then God would have to be against itself to be against anything that's going on. So I think there's a bigger arc of a story than I can understand. And I just have to accept that at some point I will see a bigger picture than I saw, and that things that seem horrible and awful to me had a bigger purpose than I could possibly understand at the time. And it contributed to a greater good or greater expansion of an infinite God. So I don't know whether, I had a discussion with somebody this weekend about it, because it's like, well, how can you look at things that are going on and say that it's all good because it's all God? And it isn't all good, but it is all God, and there must be some good in it, or it wouldn't be. And if God was against itself, everything would be destroyed, because of infinite power and infinite intelligence against itself would never be able to be sustainable. So I focus on what I'm for, not what I'm against. And I try to promote better understanding and better compassion between people with differing views. And it's a challenge, When people are horrible to other people, it's hard for me to say, well, there must be some greater good in this horribleness, because it just doesn't seem clear to me. But I do think there's plenty of room under a larger umbrella of God and our understanding of a divine intelligence behind everything, to think that there's plenty of room for us to all show up in unique and different ways and still be expressions of that one.
Could we say that God is like a cosmic teeter-totter? One board, two ends.
I don't know, same one.
Yeah.
I sort of like that idea that God is like a teeter-totter. It's one board, two ends. One is always up, one is down, one is up. Sometimes it's in balance. I like also the funness of that image.
Yes.
God on a teeter-totter.
And I don't want to hog the question answer time, but and feel free to jump in on Zoom friends as well. If you have comments or questions. I'm curious if you have any reflections about why the anti-trans laws have become a fixation point in the last 5 years. Well, why this has become the wedge issue that's been.
Well, I think it's the same thing you talked about. It challenges a theology. Certainly, we're seeing a lot of this legislation in Republican-controlled states. There's a lot of the religious right that seems very threatened by this. And I think it's a way to get people geared up about something, about a fight.
Don't you think that part of it is if, for example, if I am not gay and I try to explain to someone, let's say my mother, who's not gay and never has the experience of having that be their truth, then it's so hard for a person for whom that's not their truth to understand, to see that from the inside, as opposed to why would you want to do such a thing as that? And I think perhaps it's true as well for trans folks. How do you wrap your mind around that? That doesn't necessarily address the question of why is this. I happen to think it's because it's an easy target. That's one of the things that I think is that it's obvious, it's out more, the trans folks, and that's just easy.
Well, I think people take solace in the fact that they know the difference between a boy and a girl, okay? And I think you could say, you're telling me a lot of stuff, I gotta get used to 2 women getting married, I gotta get used to 2 men getting married, there's a lot of things I have to embrace, but by God, I know the difference between boys and girls. You're not gonna tell me that you're a boy if you don't have a penis, and you're not gonna tell me you're not a boy if you do have a penis. I mean, come on, what else are you gonna try to convince me of? So I do think there's that part of it where people feel unseen and unheard. And I think that this is an easy way to push back against it. And I get it. I mean, I don't think most people understand what in the world would motivate someone like me to do what I've done. Okay. Some days I don't know what motivated me to do what I've done. I mean, I'm really a lot happier as Christine than I ever was before, but it's like a very challenging path. So I can see why people would push against it. And then if you're worried that somebody's convincing your kids to believe differently than you do, or they're undermining your parental authority, I mean, I think it's just probably the logical, expression of pushing against sex education classes when those are being taught by other people, or any of this kind of stuff. So I think there's this whole idea that there's a trans agenda that people have, or there's a gay agenda, and those people aren't like us, and those people that don't, they're going to take it away from us. So I think it's that feeling of being under attack. But I don't know. I mean, I don't think most people have ever been harmed by a trans person, because I don't think trans persons generally do any harm to people, so it's kind of interesting. It's not like most people who are trans are really violent people or anything like that I've seen any statistics on. So it certainly is not a rational response. It feels like it's very much an emotional response to it. But
it seems as a gay person, the whole coming out process and the whole adopting children and all that kind of stuff, you come against that kind of friction, but it's the animosity. I never had to live with that in the same way. Like, I mean, I listened to Trump's comments last week, and I was just like, feared for every trans person that I know. Like, this is, you know, fueling just an awful kind of based in nothing, based in no reality. I mean, what difference does it make to somebody whether somebody chooses to live as a man or a woman? If anything, if they're choosing to be true to themselves, that probably makes us all better because there's a woman happier, more content as human
Right.
being in the world who's spreading, you know, I just, yeah, that's frightening.
Yeah,
Not
I
really
get
a
it.
question, I just, yeah,
I always sort of, oh, somebody. I always feel like, okay, so we only have, that we know of, I mean, so Rabbi Jamie, in Kabbalah, I was learning or studying that there's a multiplicity of gender expressions, in Kabbalah, like 13 or 6 or something like that, I can't remember, but exactly, I wrote a little note for David about that
Yeah,
when we were
like
studying.
6 different non-binary genders in Talmud that are, you know, described, and in Greek, ancient Greek, you know, culture as well. And the most cultures in the world, in world civilization, uh, you know, recognized, whether it's gender fluidity or spectrum of gender identity. So it's just contemporary Western civilization that has
Mhm.
fixated on this binary definition.
Well, I had a thought, you know, okay, so we have these two, right? And it's just random that you are born one or the other. And, you know, so maybe this one just doesn't really fit very well, so why not? I mean, it's like heads or tails, why not just, why would you have to stick with, and who cares if you decide to, you know, that this isn't fitting well for you. I mean, it's just, it's like, I don't know, it just doesn't make sense. If I'm a child and I'm like, oh, I feel more like a boy than a girl. I just randomly showed up as a girl anyway, so why not switch? I mean, are you gonna regret this all your life? Well, what if I regret being a girl all my life? I mean, we don't ask that question, right? So, anyway, those are some thoughts I've had about.
I think there's a surge to let the statistics around the younger generations that are becoming more courageous and standing in their truth as a divine expression, you know, and so there's this, you know, this heightened sense of these younger people, and then couple it with people with a lot of fear and want to be, you know, distracting the, you know, the real issues politically, the real, you know, things that we should really be talking about, but instead let's focus on this so that we can just, you know, get everybody really busy thinking about something that isn't even, you know, reality. So I think it's, you know, and learning in my cultural anthropology class, all of the different cultures all around the world for thousands of years that have recognized the trans community. So that's my opinion. That it's a big distraction, and there's a big surge of the younger generations, you know, the Gen Alpha, Gen Y, Gen Zs are just, they've kind of had it. So they're like, here I am, and this is who I want to express as, and having more people around them to support it, it's saving lives to me.
Yeah,
So,
I do think there is that. I think that the more restrictive people get about gender expression and gender roles, the more the younger people are pushing against it. Because it's not how they want to define themselves. And so I think that the body autonomy, whether we
Mhm.
talk about it at a lot of levels, but it's a transgender issue too. Do I have the right to determine my own body autonomy? And if so, under what circumstances? Yeah, I saw Luke had a question. So Luke asked, do you see or have you experienced any connections between misogyny and transphobia? Well, absolutely. I do. I mean, because misogyny and the patriarchy and all of this, I think, is all so intertwined. It's just, oh, you've got somebody. Oh, Heather's in here. Did you want to, shall we let her in?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't see that she was there. I'll just let her in.
Oh, Heather's here twice.
Oh, maybe she moved phones. I didn't see. Maybe she left. So. But no, I do think if you have this misogynistic worldview, then people who show up as transgender challenge that, I think, in a lot of ways, because it's just not the way, quote, it's supposed to be, right? This is not what God intended. This is not what we think, how we think it should show up. So, oh, Christine, can you speak to what you knew from the inside, in Ginny's words, that your assigned gender didn't fit? You know, it's interesting. I always thought it would be better if I'd been a girl. I just always thought I should be a girl. And I don't know what part of that was. I don't remember having any horrible experiences as a child, as a boy, that would have caused me to do that. But it just, I remember from the earliest time that I can remember thinking it would have been better if I was a girl, and I should have been a girl. I didn't ever have the feeling of being a woman trapped in a man's body. I've heard that terminology used, but that never really fit. And then come to find out later that all the people who said that were just making it up because that's what the psychologists thought you had to do if you wanted to get any kind of surgical or hormone treatment. So it was, maybe it was never real for anybody, but it was just always a sense that who I am and how I wanted to express myself would have been so much easier to do through the lens of femininity rather than through masculinity, because there are such different rules for expression. I mean, the socialization is so different between girls and boys, and that's one of the things that makes this whole journey really challenging. Is I was never socialized as a girl. My mom never had a mother-daughter talk with me, you know, about things. So it's like I had to figure this all out through osmosis, and some of it I figured out well, and some of it I'm still being surprised by what I don't know. So, but it's all right. That's kind of good. But yeah, it was just a sense from an early age that who I really was should have been a girl, not a boy. So I don't have anything more specific than that.
Can you talk, maybe this is not appropriate, about potential loss? Was there ever a sense of loss around like family or friends or you or?
Yeah, absolutely. There's always a ripple effect from our actions. So my actions to decide to be myself created ripple effects in people. Some of my friends didn't ever want to talk to me again, and they haven't. My marriage of almost 30 years ended because of my transition, which I was hoping it wouldn't, but you know, my ex had to be true to herself. And so she couldn't feel like she was being true to herself and stay married to a woman. I don't know that I really miss my old self, because I still have my old self here. You know, people once told me we should have a wake for Robert. Robert was my dead name. That was not a term I used, but my name before Christine was Robert. And it's like, well, you know, I don't know that Robert's really dead, you know. So that's felt weird to me to do that. But yeah, I mean, there is always a loss, and I don't really spend much time thinking, I wish I hadn't done this. And I don't really spend much time thinking, I wish I had transitioned when I was younger, because I have two beautiful daughters who are super supportive of me. We talk now more than we ever have, so that relationship did not end. Do they miss their old dad? I don't know. Not that they say all the time, but I would imagine they do. This is the first year we didn't celebrate me on Father's Day, because last year I told them I didn't want to be celebrated on Father's Day. And if they didn't want to celebrate me on Mother's Day, I got that. But, you know, women don't want to be celebrated on Father's Day, even though I am their father. So we kind of reached a compromise on that, that it didn't feel supportive to me anymore. So, but we don't have a lot of words for all this. You know, what do you call the woman who fathered you, right? I mean, they had a mother. If I transitioned when they were younger, I know they would call me mom, and it would be fine. They would just have two moms, but they didn't. And so then it creates a conflict with their mother if they call me mom too. So it gets complicated. You just have to compromise and try to find the best result for everybody. My granddaughters don't call me grandpa, they call me Nana. So, you know, and at some point we will explain to them why, you know, why don't you call Nana mom? And it's like, and we'll talk about that. So right now, my 3-year-old granddaughter loves the pink and blue flag that I'm flying outside my place, because she likes those colors. And so that's enough for me. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I suppose there's always some potential sense of loss. I mean, I had a really good life as my former self. It was a lot easier than this. It wasn't as meaningful as this one is. And I wasn't as happy. So, you know, it's just, I guess there's always pluses and minuses to everything.
We talked about allyship and ways that cisgender
Yeah.
can support you and you know, queer community at larger, but particularly the trans community.
Yeah, that's a great question. If you see me being picked on or singled out, don't just sit quietly by and let that happen. My transition has generally been pretty easy. I guess as easy as doing something like this ever would be. But there was one time I attended a meeting of the Denver Republican Women, because they had a speaker there who was really controversial and very anti-trans, and I was writing a scholarly paper on that, and I wanted to hear what she had to say. And even though I feel like my Republican Party has totally abandoned me, I am a lifelong Republican, so it's kind of an interesting dichotomy. I wrote one of the handouts I have is an article I wrote for one of my school papers on this dichotomy of my identity. And Reverend Josh Reeves, who was teaching the class, said, I think this is highly publishable. You ought to submit it to the Science of Mind magazine. And so I did, and they thought it was highly publishable too. So they published it last year. But it's interesting because in the first sentence of that thing, I outed myself as a transgender woman and a lifelong Republican, right? So that is guaranteed to piss off half the world. For one side or the other. And it was interesting because I only wrote it for one person, but I ended up, a whole lot of people saw that article. But back to the allyship. So I went to this meeting, and I've even gone to the state Republican convention as a transgender woman because I was really involved before my transition. And I went there and was listening to this woman who was just spewing hatred and awful things against transgender kids in Denver Public School. And I asked her during the question and answer, whether it was really necessary to use such polarizing language, whether we wouldn't have a better discussion if she was trying to ask questions about something that we might disagree about. We might have different perspectives, but when you really use polarizing language, people get defensive and they can't hear you. And for whatever reason, whether she clocked me as trans or whatever, she started me calling me one of those people and misgendering me and telling me she didn't need to know my pronouns. She knew what my pronouns were. And not a single person in that room stopped her from just picking it on me and beating me up. And I just felt so alone. And I felt so betrayed because I said, these were people who were nice to me. I mean, maybe they didn't like me really, but they were never outwardly unkind to me. And they seemed pleased when they saw me again and they recognized me from previous events, but not one of them would stand up. And so that was my one time I left that place and I was afraid to go into the women's restroom. And so I just didn't. I went home because I thought if she's in there, she'll just start screaming and yelling at me. And I just don't want to have that right now. So I think when you have power in some way, because you're cisgender or because you're male or because you're hetero or any of those things that give us power in this world, and you see somebody who clearly is getting picked on, just take the stand for them, right? Have their back. If I go to Florida ever, I hope a whole bunch of my friends will go into the restrooms with me, okay? Either that or we all go into the men's restroom together and say, well, check my DNA. I think this is where I'm supposed to be, right? But it just, all those things get inside your head when you have, and you probably recognize that when you have this feeling people are out to get you, or they just hate you before they even know you. It so messes with you. So I guess that's what I would say from an allyship is just to try to let people know they're not alone, or let people know that even if you see them, you still support them, even if you don't understand them. I mean, you don't have to understand everything to support it, and just allow a space for it. I mean, I think that's sometimes some of the kindest things we ever do as human beings is just hold a space for somebody to be themselves. I think men are socialized to be problem solvers, but sometimes just listening to somebody speak their truth is the most supportive thing anybody can do, right? I mean, that's the biggest challenge I have with my brother now, who's very supportive of me, but every time I want to talk to him about something, he wants to tell me how he's going to fix the problem or how I need to fix it. And it's like, I don't need you to fix the problem. I just need you to listen to me, because sometimes it gets clearer in my brain when I speak it out loud.
Sure.
So that would be what I would say.
I think too, for me, it's about educating myself and exposing myself to different information to learn more about people that are different than me. So that when something comes up in a conversation with people that have a negative opinion, that I can share with them from an educated standpoint to advocate for people in the trans or queer community. And I was thinking about, some documentaries I've watched where the trans community is really depicted in really negative ways in early films and in movies. And so we all have this really limited thought of what someone that's transgender, our thought of who they are. And so to really be educating ourselves and kind of moving away from those early depictions to help just, I want to understand. So I just try to really, educate myself, and then have courageous conversations with people in my family that are more conservative or different politically, or have these really strong opinions, and just have the courage to be able to talk in an educated way to support people.
No, you make a really good point, Westland. I mean, I think there's a movie on Netflix called Disclosure, which may be the one you're speaking about, and it talks about how trans people are depicted in films, and it's always horrible. I mean, it's just horrible. And if that's your only way you know anything about trans people, you think that, And if you're a trans kid looking at that, you think, I must be horrible because this is, everybody laughs at people like me and everybody makes fun of people like me. And I think certainly for a while, the gay community experienced that too, right? As the gay men were represented as jokes and things like that, and very, very caricature-ish kind of things. And so then all of a sudden, if you think, wow, that's who I am, and then I'm just destined to be a joke. So I do think self-education like that is helpful. For the last couple of years, I've hosted the Transgender Day of Remembrance webinar that Centers for Spiritual Living do, because I'm on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. And I think that's a really good way to have an appreciation for, that's a really good way to have an appreciation for what goes on in the community. I mean, Brazil is a horrible place to be transgender. I mean, they killed over 100 transgender people last year, and they just murdered them in brutal ways. And you look at the faces of these people, and you just think, oh my gosh, you can see the joy in who they are being themselves, and you think, you have so much courage because you will never be, not seen as a transgender person because they just don't look very feminine, but they look happy. And, but I mean, that kind of thing is another way to have empathy and compassion for that. There's a book called This Is How It Always Is that talks about a family raising a transgender child. And I found that book a really touching book to read too, because people think it's like so easy, and being a parent of a transgender person is so simple. You know how you'd be with this, and it's like, no, you don't. You'd have no idea how because you care about your kid and you want them to be happy. You don't know the right thing, and they don't know how to tell you what the right thing is. So I think those are both good suggestions too. Thanks, Wesley. Oh yeah, we do have another.
Irene had one more question about the ratio of transgender men to transgender women. If there are more.
Well, I think there are generally more transgender women than men. Transgender men are more something that's coming out more recently in terms of coming out. A lot of times what people who would, I guess my sense would be that a lot of times what we would think of as a transgender man would just have been considered a lesbian in a lot of ways, but but now they're feeling more empowered to say, no, I'm just a lesbian, masculine lesbian. I feel more like a man. So, but I still think I don't have any statistics or numbers exactly, but my sense is just within the community that there are more trans feminine people than there are trans masculine.
Do you know why? Could you guess why?
Well, certainly the surgery is not as acceptable or successful trying to do that. I mean, it's easy most transgender men that I know have top surgery to remove breasts so that they don't feel like the breasts are very dysphoric. But most of the time trying to do any kind of surgery to build a penis if you weren't born with one is not very successful. But I don't know whether that has anything to do with it or not. From an identity standpoint.
It's interesting because females are second-class citizens in many ways, and yet I can understand that the surgery aspect, it makes a big, is an huge obstacle. But it's interesting that so many people choose to become female. It's almost like they're helping the cause in somewhat. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like, yeah.
Well, say more about that, because I do think it's interesting, but yes, I think I know what you're getting at.
Well, in Judaism, there's a lot of misogyny. Traditionally, I come from a long line of Jews where women were second-class citizens. And so one would think that women would want to become men so they could have that automatic power that's granted when you walk into a room like a man. But instead, people who have that power are saying, I don't want that, I want this other thing. So that's what interests me.
And it might be a different motivation. I don't know that I decided to become a woman to disempower myself, okay? And I do think you're right. I mean, my few trans male friends feel very empowered. They feel empowered that they are able to grow a beard because of the testosterone. That is a very visible sign of masculinity. And their voice lowers when they're on it. You know, taking estrogen does not make your voice go high again. Okay, so if your voice is higher than it was before, it's because you've worked on it or paid attention to it. But yeah, it is interesting. A couple of people who just thought my gender transition was the most insane thing they ever heard of were women who thought, why would you give up all that male privilege to do this? And it which just speaks to what you're talking about a bit. I don't think most men know how privileged they are until they aren't, okay? I certainly have a lot more appreciation for how privileged I was, but didn't know it at the time. So it's always interesting when you know, cis white males don't think they're discriminated against and don't have all the power. It's like, really, I just don't think you've noticed. The deck is stacked in your favor all the time. But you know, we don't know what we don't know. And so it's interesting.
Well, I think it implies there's a choice or that I'm making a decision as if, you know, that I'm born as a pansexual woman, that I made a decision to be attracted to both men and women and non-binary, whereas that's just for me the way I was born. And so I didn't pick it. And so when to say that I would make a decision to help a cause implies that I had a choice in the matter. And really it's this internal, just that's who I am.
I was thinking more of divine plan rather than individual choice. You know what I'm saying? Like this energy is moving in this direction. Why is that?
Because we need the divine feminine. It's sorely missing from our world.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. Yeah, I did one of my scholarly papers on the removal of the divine feminine from the Hebrew Bible and the Christian texts, and the divine feminine was worshipped far more before patriarchy came in, and somehow that all just got wiped out and never was there. So back to the Greek, spirit is a feminine noun. And so when the spirit of God comes in, is it not the feminine aspect of God coming in? You know, but that's probably a bigger topic than this evening. But
No, I think we could cover
you
it.
think? Let's move on to peace in the Middle East, because that would be a good thing to figure out too. But the one thing I'll say about that, I agree. I don't think I consciously ever made a decision about being transgender, but I consciously made a decision as to whether I lived my authentic truth. So the choice that I made was that I didn't want to die with no one knowing who I was, and I didn't want to die feeling like I'd been a fraud my whole life, even though it might have been easier to do that. So I do think that's the choice we make, is do we act it authentically as ourselves, or do we decide that other people know better for us than we know? And that's maybe the difference. So.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And I think it's an appropriate question. I believe that I was not capable of holding space for people until someone held space for me. And until you have that experience of somebody truly seeing you and being with you, you can try, but you're not really very good at holding space for other people. So I'm just curious, what were the most important sort of factors or people that, as you came closer to making the decision that I have to be true to myself, how did those people hold space for you?
I've done a lot of personal development work, probably since my late 20s, trying to make sense of me and this world. I did a lot of counseling, but I went into some coaching. I had a life coach around the time before my transition. And she and I spent a lot of time working on this because Christine just kept getting louder and louder, and she just didn't want to never have her say. And I refer to myself in the third person with some degree of humor, but Christine didn't always have a name, but she always was the most precious part of me, and I was just never willing to kill that part of me. But as my life went on, it just kept getting louder and louder that we need to do something about this. You need to own this part of yourself publicly. And I didn't know what that looked like. So my coach, Heather Steele, was very instrumental in holding a space for me and giving me a platform to say, I want to do a presentation and I want to appear as Christine. And then figuring out, oh my goodness, what would that look like, and how will I do it? Because I don't have any clothes and I don't have any of this stuff. So there was that. And then I just felt so amazing and thought I looked so amazing that I just thought, oh, this might be able to actually do this, And then Mile High was very supportive too. I transitioned in Dr. Rogers' Beyond Limits class in 2017. I started as Robert and I ended as Christine. And that was the most courageous thing that I had done too. And it's odd because I just never thought anybody would notice, but most everybody who was in that class remembers that class. So it's interesting, but yeah, I think there were a couple places along the lines where people had space for that. For me, trying to be fluid, I would volunteer in the youth ministry at Mile High, and the kids would say, "Are you a boy or a girl?" And it's like, I'm not sure. I think I might be both. Oh, okay. And kids are pretty good about it. They're all right. I mean, they just had a question because I presented confusingly enough to them, they weren't really sure. And then at some point I decided, and I ended up transitioning on Easter Sunday of all days, right? Very nice and symbolic. Right? And it was mostly because a lot of people go to church at Mile High on Easter and they needed me to volunteer, and I wanted a new name tag, and I didn't want to have it be not the right name anymore. So I transitioned on Easter Sunday. The kids were like, "I thought you were a boy." I said, "No, I told you I wasn't sure, but now I'm sure I'm a girl." Oh, okay. So anyway.
Any closing thoughts that you want to offer?
No, I certainly appreciate the invitation to be here. The more we can all find a place in our heart to be kinder to other people and people who are different. I often ask people, just be curious, okay? Don't immediately jump to conclusions. If you're curious about me as a transgender woman, just ask if it's okay to ask me about it. If you're curious how the hell I could be a Republican, just ask me about it. Don't immediately judge me as being awful, right? Because I'm not awful. I'm just a person who tries to make sense of this world in the best way that I can. And I think we're all doing that in some way. So if we could all be more curious and less judgmental about things, I think it would be a better kind of world, and we might just learn something too. But with regard to transgender folks, just ask permission before you make assumptions. Generally it's not polite to ask people about body parts or things like that, because it really isn't any of their business. I haven't asked one of you about your body parts tonight, and I don't really need to know. And, in the interest of disclosure, I'm sharing a lot more personal things than normally I feel inspired to do, but that's part of it, right? If you really want to do it, say, are you open to me asking you some questions? And if I ask you something that's really uncomfortable, just say, no, that's really out of line, or don't ask somebody that. And then you'll know, but that's that curiosity without judgment helps. So I think that's what I would say. So
That's great.
thank you.
Thank
I have
you.
a quick question.
Of course.
Just really, do you dream when you're dreaming. What?
I love it, go.
Go for
Well, I'm
it.
so
Oh, it's a
sorry.
great
A lot of
question.
times when I'm dreaming, I'm not necessarily feminine. Well, never feminine. Let's be honest. But when I'm dreaming, I'm so gender fluid, so I don't know.
Okay,
I know people dream in their own language and.
that's a wonderful question. I do dream fluidly gender-wise. And I notice it, and I've even judged myself for it. I've introduced myself in my dreams to someone using my dead name, and then I thought, that's not my name anymore. And so I'm aware of that.
Well,
And sometimes I'm with my ex-wife, and sometimes I can't tell whether I'm male or female, and sometimes I'm clearly female because I know I have clothes that are female. So I kind of go back and forth with it, and I've come to accept that that's okay. It's hard to be presented to the world for 61 years in one way and then start presenting as another and not have all sorts of things in my subconscious that are still finding their neutral zone. But that's interesting you would ask me that.
All right, well, thank you. And thank you, friends on Zoom, for joining us, and hopefully, we have a Billy Joel Shabbat, Paul Simon, Billy Joel service on Friday. If you can join us for that, hopefully outside in the amphitheater. Anything else for about that? So in Saturday, we have Susan Kerr doing movement as our Word to Deed program.
9:00 a.m.
9:00 on Saturday. And then in July, we have a couple of past presidents, Rich Levine and David Froman, talking about this pivotal juncture in Beth Evergreen's history as we prepare to celebrate 50 years as a congregation. Building a building, hiring a full-time rabbi, affiliating with the Reconstruction movement, and finding out about that critically. And then in August, there'll be a series on Reconstructionism and sort of Reconstructionism 101. What is that form of Judaism?
A real taboo topic.
That's it.
Really gonna dig in.
Well, it was like all in the foreword in May about the Reconstructionist movement and Zionism and anti-Zionism and all sorts of things. So there'll be plenty of taboo things we can touch. That's any other announcements to share?
Pride's this weekend. in
Pride
Denver,
this
so
weekend
go
in
to
Denver.
Pride.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
If you want to walk with Resilience 1220, just go on the website and sign up.
Wonderful. Thank you, Heather.
Oh,
thank
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Jenny, for hosting.
Oh.
We'll
Yay, Jenny.
yeah, have a great night. All right. Thanks. Happy Pride.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for coming.